These gasoline prices are absolutely out of control. These gasoline prices don't need to be where they are. And it's not because of some conspiracy, some conspiracy between businesses or individuals or countries or anything of the sort. It's because your government wants to drive up the price of fuel. And the reason is simple. The President, his Secretary of Energy, have said and believe that the only way to embrace green technology, which they can neither define nor point to, is to reduce your reliance on fossil fuels. And since you won't do it voluntarily in a free country, they're going to do it to you with authoritarian policies. That's exactly what's happening. Your government is intervening in the market so thoroughly that it is driving up the cost of gasoline. Now, they want you to focus on the oil companies and their profits. Why don't we instead focus on what's causing this? Because I can talk about their profits. I did the other day. And the news media, I'm 53 and a half years old. They have covered this energy issue exactly the same way since I was a kid. It's a cycle. The government intervenes, or in some cases OPEC intervenes. The prices go up. Everybody screams, get the oil companies. The price goes down. And we have it over and over and over again. But this time, the price is so preposterous that I want to spend a few minutes on this. Now, back in September of 2008, the Wall Street Journal interviewed Mr. Chu, Stephen Chu. He is your energy secretary. Have you ever heard of him before? And in December of 2008, they interviewed him in September. In December 2008, they revealed some of what their interview disclosed, hat tip to Red State. And Mr. Chu said in the interview with the Wall Street Journal in September 2008, somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe. This is the man in charge of the Energy Department. Now, the levels in Europe are between $7 and $9. We're getting there. That was a stated desire of the Secretary of Energy. Somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels of Europe. Now, as I continued researching today, I came along a piece from the Baltimore Reporter. I just want to bring this all together because when you listen to the news at the top of the hour, you won't hear any of this. It'll just be the same pablum. Top oil company executives asked Congress on Wednesday to open the nation's coasts to offshore drilling as the Obama administration continued reversing Bush White House policies that opened national land and coasts to oil exploration. For people who want shortages and to drive up the price, it's funny, there they are in full view of the whole world telling Congress, please let us drill. Please. The choice is clear. We can continue to import increasing volumes of oil and gas, or we can develop more of our own domestic resources, said Marvin Odom, president of the Shell Oil Company. Producing more oil and gas in our own country is a no-lose proposition. Executives from Shell, BP America, Devon Oil Company, ExxonMobil, and Chevron testified before the House Committee on Natural Resources as it held its final 3 hearings to determine the nation's offshore drilling policy. Democratic lawmakers, however, have been tepid to move quickly on offshore drilling, saying they prefer to examine further what resources are available offshore. Now, it goes on. Former President George W. Bush lifted an executive ban on offshore drilling last summer, and Democratic lawmakers allowed a congressional moratorium to last year in the final stretch of the 2008 elections, with gasoline prices hovering around $4 a gallon. Meanwhile, Interior Secretary Ken Salazar continued the Obama administration's policy of halting Bush administration rules and regulations, announcing he would pull leases for oil shale research and development and allow 90 days for comment. Earlier this month, Mr. Salazar halted a Bush administration plan to lease underwater plots on the nation's outer continental shelf, asking for additional public comment before setting a 5-year drilling policy. They are constantly killing new research that does not involve wind and solar, like shale. They are constantly pulling leases, pulling permits, obstructing efforts. This is from the L.A. Slimes. The Interior Department blocked a Bush administration plan to open parts of the Mountain West for oil shale development, announcing it would first study the water, power, and land use issues that complicate one of the nation's most abundant but controversial untapped sources of energy. Salazar canceled shale development leases on federal land in Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and launched a second round of leases in the region limited to research purposes. In doing so, he rebuked what he called former President George Bush's headlong rush to begin development. I love the way the liberals are constantly saying, well, that's so far off, it won't help us today. This was 2.5 years ago. The liberals don't care about today or tomorrow. It's their agenda. It's their ideology that they advance. Here we have Fox News, April 25th of this year, 2011. Shell Oil Company has announced it must scrap efforts to drill for oil this summer in the Arctic Ocean off the northern coast of Alaska. The decision comes following a ruling by EPA's Environmental Appeals Board to withhold critical air permits. The move has angered some in Congress and triggered a flurry of legislation aimed at stripping the EPA of its oil drilling oversight. Shell has spent 5 years and nearly $4 billion on plans to explore for oil in the Beaufort and, up there in Alaska, I don't know how to pronounce this, Chukchi Seas, I think. The leases alone cost $2.2 billion. Shell Vice President Pete Slaby says abandoning similar air permits for a drilling operation in the Gulf of Mexico would take about 45 days. So they pulled out of the Gulf. They pulled out of Alaska. The EPA's Appeals Board ruled that Shell had not taken into consideration emissions from an ice-breaking vessel when calculating overall greenhouse gas emissions. So using global warming, CO2, to block drilling. Anything that works. Well, what's left? Let's see, the Gulf, Alaska, other offshore areas, oil shale, what's left? This is from December 23, 2010, just a few months ago. Reuters, the Obama administration has restored U.S. land managers' powers to curb development on vast tracts of America's backcountry, undoing what conservation groups called a no more wilderness policy put in place under George W. Bush. In other words, the extremists, no-growth, flat earth, Marxist environmentalists are choking us. We can't get to our resources. And they are represented, not you and me, they are represented by this president, the EPA, and this Interior Department. U.S. Secretary of Interior Ken Salazar announced the Federal Bureau of Land Management will again have the authority to set aside large areas of federally owned territory in the West that it deems deserving of wilderness protection. So that would make it impossible, folks, to gain access to these areas to drill, because you can't put roads in, you can't put trucks in, you can't transport, you can't build, you can't do anything. Pretty much humans are not allowed. So that was a power that belongs to Congress. Utah Republican Senator Orrin Hatch denounced the policy shift as a brazen attempt by the Obama administration to usurp congressional control of wilderness designations. BLM manages 245 million acres of public lands, mostly in 11 western states, massive wilderness areas, and we can't get to them. So they block oil shale. Just add it up. They're blocking more and more wilderness areas on the say-so of bureaucrats. They're blocking offshore drilling. They're blocking new drilling in Alaska. And, of course, we know about the Gulf. Gee, no wonder they keep saying, it's not a supply issue, it's speculators. Not a supply, don't look at us. Ignore all the news articles from the past 2.5 years. Ignore all our press releases. Ignore all our chest beating to our environmental, radical, no-growth, flat earth, Marxist friends, where we are bragging about how we're stopping oil and gas production. Ignore all that. Blame the speculators. Find them like we're on the Salem witch hunt here. One more. You ready? Our friends at the Media Research Center. Even though gas prices had bounced up and down and were on the decline in May 2010 after the oil spill on the Gulf, prices have shot up in the past year. Gasoline, $2.73 per gallon when Obama instituted his 6-month moratorium on deep water and shallow drilling on May 30, 2010. Prices are now more than $1 a gallon higher. Pump prices have more than doubled since Obama took office in January 2009. Keep in mind with the BP matter, this administration lied to a federal judge. This administration was in contempt to a federal judge. That's how committed they are to their radical no-growth policies. It's not a supply issue. It's the speculators. Oh, and we can't get any more oil for 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something. I was Deputy Solicitor of the Department of Interior for a period of time in the Reagan administration. We have locations where they can drill in 6 months and get oil and natural gas. In many cases, they're existing wells. It doesn't take 10 years to get a well up and running. Now, some tough areas where you're doing exploration or you need new technologies or I get all that, but don't let them tell you that every single location is a 10-year deal. It's simply not. They're withholding right now permits on leases in the Gulf of Mexico, which we know are viable because they were pumping oil, but they're blocking them. We know there's massive amounts of fuel in Alaska. They won't let us touch it, and we know how to get it. North Dakota, Colorado, and Utah with shale, they're blocking us. That's why they keep saying, and I'll repeat, forget about, it's not a supply and demand issue, it's speculators. I'm going to tell you about speculators in a second, but let's go back to the Media Research Center. Of 14 permits submitted for initial exploratory drilling in the Gulf, 13 are still pending. The EPA is also seeking to regulate the oil industry over greenhouse gas. This is brand new, by the way. So now the EPA's in on the action. Does the EPA support capitalism? Does the EPA support private enterprise? Does the EPA support production, success, natural resources, access to them, the use of them? No. So through global warming and gas emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the EPA is now in on it, which means it's going to be even harder. And so the EPA is also seeking to regulate the oil industry over greenhouse gas emissions, and the BLM, under Obama appointee Ken Salazar, would issue new rules making it harder to develop natural resources on government-owned land. That's not all. On March 15th of this year, the American Petroleum Institute released a press release criticizing the administration for new environmental hurdles to build a pipeline that would transport crude from Canadian oil sands. This much-studied and much-needed pipeline would provide a critical link to our largest energy supplier, Canada, its vast resources of nearby and available crude oil. Why are they doing that? Oh, you don't know why? We all know why. Now, what about these speculators? The Heritage Foundation explained how trading oil futures worked earlier this year. The oil futures market is just that, a futures market. The price per barrel spikes in oil this week have not affected the domestic market yet. People are betting on the future price of fuel. They can't bet on today's price because we already know what today's price is. So they're not driving up prices today. They're speculating based on what they see the country's doing, including what the price will be a month or 2 or 3 down the road. We'll be right back.